test-driven development.
Have you ever actually really done that? It's an enigma. There's a mystery in there that I can't quite put my finger on.
Today, we're going to be talking about test-driven development. Let's just quickly talk about what it is and the concept of it, because we've talked a lot about it probably in other episodes, but let's just quickly set the stage and set the benchmark so we all know what we're talking about. So the whole concept of test-driven development is that before you write any bit of functionality, now this is my definition, is before you write any bit of functionality, you first write your tests, and your tests have to fail. And then as you're building out your functionality, hopefully the tests will start to pass. And often by the end, and this is what I learned, is that you will often have more test code, or you could have more test code than actual code which runs the functionality which you are actually testing. So the whole point of test-driven development is that you have tests that have to pass for you to push the project forward. Now, with that, Bevan, what are your opinions about test-driven development?
Opinions? At some point, I'm going to ask
your experience as well.
Yeah. The first thing coming to my mind after I speak a bit is I'll probably throw it back to you and go, have you ever actually really done that?
Right. By all means.
Because, yeah, have I? In short spurts here and there, that's one of those things I've found in work. You're often so pressured and under the pump to get things done that learning a new skill like that makes you slower first because you've got the learning curve. It's changing the way you think, changing the way you behave. You've got to learn the right tests. You've got to learn the structure, the syntax, the gotchas that trip you up. I imagine in order to learn this effectively, you need to be on a team with a hell of a lot of support to back you up, not just support, encouragement. However, TDD's been around for a long time, and TDD, to the letter of the law of test-driven development, is exactly, to my mind, exactly how you described it. You write very little small units of tests for methods. You write the test, write a bit of code, see if the test passes, and you develop like that. So it's like, I have studied this technique, but have I ever tested that way? No. Have I ever tested? Absolutely. I've written lots of tests in my life, but to the letter of the strictness of test-driven development, I'd have to say no.
Yes.
I feel like I completely understand exactly what it is and how to go it and the principles. But I also think if you threw it at me and said, okay, we're doing test-driven development, go, I would slow my productivity, it'd slow right down.
Yes.
At first, I imagine it gets better, but I've also personally never been in an environment that allowed for the slowdown. So that's pretty much my opinion on it. And beyond that, whether it's a good idea and whether it's effective in the long run, I can't tell you. I can tell you the rhetoric. Yeah.
Well, I have similar opinions as well, because I remember when this was brought up at a pub chat one time, and they were saying how whenever they estimate for websites to be built in a certain certain CMS, I'm not going to mention it, just because we mention it all the time, they would often say, yes, we can write tests, but it's going to be 20 to 30% higher, the budget for the actual website. But then they try and sell it as, well, upgrading is going to be easier. But then my experience with test-driven development, because I've worked on a few projects where we have had it. And as you mentioned, you need to be in a team. That's the first thing. You need to also have, and I hate using this word because I feel too corporate-y, but you need somebody to champion it. You need somebody to literally sit on it and work with the developers and take ownership. And I'm going to use another word, and you need a developer to take ownership, to empower other developers. Because
I love it.
I have worked recently in a team where we would have developers that are blocked for days because they have to fix up a test because a new version of a module has come out, or we've upgraded to a new version of PHP or a new version of MySQL, which then broke tests. And then all of a sudden you're trying to fix up issues And recently for Drupal, oh, sorry, I mentioned that. I mentioned that CMS.
Hey, no, I love it.
Yeah, people
As the
haven't.
editor has to go through and note these things.
Well, there's as I probably mentioned, there's people haven't taken a shot every single time we say Drupal. But I do know the last time I did a Drupal 9 to 10 upgrade, we had Selenium tests in our code base. And for some reason, the way the Chrome headless browser just, we kind of had to give up because we were running an older version of it, and it just blocked us for a week where we were trying to get it working, and we just kind of gave up on it. And it's like, okay, we'll only have a few tests running. But it did catch a bunch of stuff. So I don't know, like I'm still on the fence on it. I do think that having tests for important paths. Now, I don't know if you've heard about this like happy path and concepts of like I heard it somewhere where like the happy path is always the most optimal path that a user will use the application. And you don't want to test that because users can use your website in any different way.
They probably use it in a way other than the one that you chose.
Exactly. And it's kind of like when you hand it over to a QA, to the QA team, they all of a sudden use the website differently. Yeah. And it's like, hey, why are you using it that way? I told you to use it this way, but then it's like, no, you need to handle it. Yeah. But I do think if you have tests for paths that aren't the quote unquote happy path, but that are very repetitive, then that's where it's important to have tests. So a great example could be for forms, especially if you have different variations of forms. That's important. But having tests just to fill out a bunch of Drupal fields and then you assert to see if the field data appears on the front end isn't that useful because Drupal has its own bunch of tests. And that's it. And also before I chuck it back to you, because I don't want to talk for too long, one issue that I've had recently is not having a consistent automated process that actually runs these tests on either daily or a nightly basis. Because if you rely on your developers to run the tests locally and they take 20 minutes to run, developers aren't going to run them. Understand that. They will give up. They will chuck it out and be like, forget it. They will remember, oh yeah, the last time we ran a test was, I don't know, 3 months ago. Oh yeah, let's just run it. And then pow, you have a whole bunch of broken tests. And then it's like, oh, we need to get this thing shipped. Let's forget about it. And then all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of broken tests. And it's kind of like the broken window. Have you heard of that broken window? I don't know what it's called, where it's like if you have one broken window, then other people see it. Then all of a sudden everyone has broken windows. It's the same thing with tests. As soon as you have one broken test, if you let that one pass, then it's like, we have, one broken test already. What's two? And then before you know it,
I totally believe that's a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And then that's why you need somebody to champion and to empower other developers and to kind of take ownership of the test and then run it.
Scrum Master.
Run with it.
I've taken so many notes while you're speaking that I'd like you sparking off so many ideas about different things. I'm not sure what order to approach these in because you've covered and touched a lot of things I've thought about before.
Yeah.
And I'll bring it up. A lot of what you discussed in my mind is not test-driven development. It's testing. Things like Selenium tests for a start, I don't think come under the branch of test-driven development. The reason being, one aspect that my understanding of test-driven development is that because you write a small test, you write a bit of code, you write a test, you write a bit of code, you're writing unit tests. So that means like a Selenium test runs on a bootstrap site. when you're doing test-driven development, you should be able to run all your tests in under 30 seconds. Like the whole process of write a bit of code, write
Yes.
write a test, write a bit of code, run your test. It should take about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Now, if you're doing anything other than unit tests, you've got no hope in hell, right? As soon as you go outside of anything that needs to bootstrap something, so that's my understanding of test-driven development. And I think this is part of what happens out in the culture is buzzwords come along, people come up with test-driven development, it gets sold as a great thing. And I do believe that some people pick up those words, unconsciously make an assumption about what test-driven development means, don't necessarily dig into it, then go and also spread the buzzword, start going, yeah, we're doing test-driven development, and they're not, right? They're doing development and they're doing tests, and they're spruiking that tests are important, and they are, but they're not doing test-driven development because test-driven development is a specific approach to testing, right?
Yes.
And it's about unit testing and writing very small units of tests, and that's outside functional testing, behavioral testing. So when even in these notes, things like BHAT and Cypress, I think would come outside of that scope. Now, what was the other thing? Now, you did mention a couple of things. I like your reference to happy paths and unhappy paths. I think I understand what you're talking about there. I've seen it diagrammed before. Someone had a photo of a park with a concrete path through the park, and then at the end, there's on the grass there was a worn dirt track where everybody walks. And the idea was that, hey, look, someone's designed a path and they've designed it that they want people to walk there, but everybody's walking the other way anyway.
Yeah.
So the trick is just concrete where they walk and and change the path, because people are going to walk where they're going to walk. Which is interesting because I know there's a correlation to that I learned when I used to do team building facilitation. When you get people to line up, I'd lay a rope on the ground and say, line up on the rope, and they'd all line up in a straight line. If you didn't put the rope there, you'd be there for 10 minutes getting them to line up straight. It's people tend to follow structures, but it's deeper than that. They follow the path of least resistance. Yeah. So even if you put a path, if it's easier to take a shortcut, they'll take the shortcut anyway.
Yeah.
So just that's on the happy paths bit. I jumped onto that. So we're talking test-driven development. However, our conversation's inherently going to veer into testing because, as I said, I don't think I've ever worked on a team that really did test-driven development. I've worked on teams that did tests, and I ran into all the same issues that you brought up. I've worked with Selenium tests myself, specifically using Drupal testing traits. Which that's what it uses underneath, I believe. It's just a headless Chrome browser. I don't think it necessarily counts as Selenium. I'm not up on the tech, but it does.
Yeah, we
use a headless browser to access your actual live site and run automated scripts against the site and pretend to be a user, essentially.
Yeah, we had issues trying to run it locally where if you have Chrome installed, like the version of Chrome that you have as a browser affects which headless driver you use. It was.
I did it all inside. I've only ever set it up myself. Been trying to be the one that champions this, right? End up doing it all myself, set it up myself, ran it inside Lando. So I didn't necessarily have that.
You could, yes. But my biggest gripe with that was, and this comes back to just testing in general. How do you debug this stuff? Because when it fails, you randomly get some random error, and we're going to probably get comments saying, "Oh, you just need to sort out your tools," and which I totally agree. But those tools, you spend a week setting them up, everything's great, then all of a sudden something changes,
someone upgrades it,
and then it breaks. And then I think you even brought it up before in one of the Slack channels about everything's great until it breaks. Lando, it's like you do a Lando up or whatever, and then all of a sudden it breaks.
Something upstream changes.
Yeah, something upstream, and then you spend the next day trying to debug it.
I mean, that is a thing with software. If you're out, for example, I love the analogy of sharpen the saw, right? Which I got from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People way back, reading that 20 years ago or more. And the principle of sharpening the saw, like you can sit there and saw through a tree as much as you like, but every once in a while you got to stop, take the time to sharpen the saw, and you'll get through. By stopping, you'll end up getting through quicker.
Yeah.
But in software, you're there trying to maintain your tools, and then you come in the next day and your tools update, right? It's like you spend all day sharpening your saw, and you come in the next day and someone swapped it out for a rusty one, right? It's literally what happens sometimes when things update. I find that frustrating in this job. But specifically with the home headless using Drupal testing traits, I did find that you'd find little bugs that weren't necessarily with your site, right? There were little things like couldn't click that button because it hadn't loaded yet.
Yeah,
that kind of stuff, right? And you'd have to write a delay in there, and it's a bug the user would never see because the user takes human length of time to scroll down to the button, but the computer does it so fast that
I remember that problem.
Yeah, that's the big issue I used to come across the most when I would say played with that. I've been on projects where I'm trying to set this up to champion it because it is important to have tests. And you're like, we don't have tests, let's get tests. And it ends up on my shoulders being the one and then that's the same thing. You're in this environment where that kind of slowdown is not tolerated. And it's like, it's supposed to make you work faster and easier and more effective. And you're spending days debugging the testing framework itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I've been looking at using things like Cypress, even Playwright, which is a JavaScript based testing, like a visual testing.
I saw that on your notes.
System. And the good thing is that it has a debug mode where it literally opens up a browser, shows you exactly, and it goes through each assert, and you can play it bit by bit and see exactly what is happening. Because for one of my other live streams, so just a free plug, I do live streams over at WebWash. And also buy Bevan's course about content marketing. Yes. Yep. There you go. We're doing all the plugs. But one of my live streams that I'm thinking of doing this week is my part 2 of actual Drupal site building where I'm building out a site. And one of the parts I do want to cover is using Playwright to actually test the flow. Now, I could do it all through testing, Drupal
testing traits.
Drupal testing traits, yes. But then I was like, but Playwright is more visual. You can see it. And it's much easier to debug when it fails. And also, it is being used as the user intends to use it by literally clicking on it, because it
actually drives an actual browser. Well,
it drives an actual browser. That's it. It's all node based.
I do want to question you a little because, and I'll ask you what node based means in a second. Because my experience with Drupal testing traits was you could actually get it to pop up a browser. Well, mind you, you didn't see the mouse move around, for example.
Well, you won't see the mouse move, but
you can turn Xdebug on and step through because it's not running low level. It's quite abstracted away. And I've used it in that manner. I mean, I've used that tool to create demos before. I've gone and written up I actually had it got the testing thing to insert a div into the top that said this page, this test, this is what's running, this is what we expect to see, and you could and actually recorded it and go, not only is it a test, it's a demo of how to use the feature, which is something I want to work on. But that's and I used Xdebug quite extensively in that manner, and had a browser that popped up that I could actually watch it play through and record it. Was it recording it itself, or did I just turn on my screen? Did I just pop it? I can't remember now. I might have just got the browser to run automatically and just recorded the screen. Might be how I did that. But I'm interested to see the nuances in how you say you got more visibility. It's easier to debug, because when you say those, I'm like, as much as I complained about how finicky and unstable I found it because of those delays and things, there are, I believe there was other little issues, but they're along that kind of line. I found it that when it is visible and you can debug it.
Okay.
So
Maybe it was just my setup or something like that. But I just
yeah,
felt
I'm curious.
that
That's all.
using something like Playwright and even Cypress, but I've heard that Cypress is on the way out and Playwright is now the popular one.
Oh,
It's like it keep changing.
I've had a passing experience with Cypress when I worked on a team who had a tester and the tester
Yeah.
and the tester set up the framework and he wrote the tests, right? Which when we're talking about TDD, what's going on there? Why is somebody else writing the tests?
Well, sometimes, well, if you use
go.
Behat,
That's how it's designed.
That's how it's designed, where you use that natural language. Well, what is it called? Gherkin?
Yeah.
Oh, you got to
based
love
on
these
cucumber.
names, man. Is it gherkin or cucumber?
No, I believe there was a technology called cucumber, and I think gherkin's an abstraction of that.
Okay. So I am
Right.
using the right terminology. Of course. Developers choose better names. But yeah, that's it. The whole point of Behat, the way I understood it, was that the project manager, or essentially the BA, should be able to write the tests.
Yes.
And in the perfect world, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In the perfect world, the absolute perfect world, you could grab your ACs, that's acceptance criteria, and chuck those into Behat, and then it should pass. Now, there are a few people that I know in the community that love Behat, and when I've used it and it's worked well.
Why do they love it?
I have no idea.
Okay. All right. I don't know.
Because I guess they just find it easier.
What you just spoke to, you just to reiterate what you just said, it's designed for somebody who's not the developer and not necessarily a technical person to be able to write the tests. Yeah. In every project I've ever worked on where they implemented it, guess who was writing the tests?
The developers.
Yeah. Right. So then I had to learn that when I already knew, like, it's just some of these tools, I just find they end up these awesome abstractions to make things easier. And they just mean I've got more shit to learn. Pardon me. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Mind you, I'm noticing an analogy to I don't want to say it now, to Drupal, because we sometimes talk about Drupal as a low code things like views and stuff, and it's sold. And you have a lot of Drupal site builders out there. There are some amazing people who are mostly site builders. The ones that I know personally end up becoming developers anyway, because they need to get into the code and change things to get done but you just abstracted away the development into another environment. Anyhow, I've made this argument before a little bit, not to say don't do it, but the idea that this then enables people who aren't technical to then go and build a website. When the rubber hits the road, it doesn't, though. It's just the developers, it's just a new developer tool. It doesn't replace developers. And I find things like that, I'm just making that analogy to things like Gherkin or Behat. Right? It's designed for a non-technical person to use, and in every world I've ever seen it used, it's the technical people that use it.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is even if you are a developer, if you do standardize on it, it is a little refreshing that you don't have to write code to manage absolutely all of it. And also, you could write AI. You could write some prompts to get ChatGPT to generate it for you.
Oh, yeah, could. Now, I haven't used it since ChatGPT wasn't even on my radar back when I was writing tests like that. That's
yeah,
wow. Oh,
so you could actually use AI to write a lot of your tests, and I do think maybe that's where AI can really help. It's like, all right, you write the tests for me and generate it.
Yeah, well, that's where
and then see what it comes back with. That's why,
to be honest, that's what I want to see their code generating AIs do. I've not seen anybody demo it, but an AI that writes its test and then writes the the solution and then runs the test against it. That's not how it works. It writes code, goes, oh, that code's like a developer, like a non-testing developer does. It writes code, runs the code, got an error. Ooh, what's that error mean? Go and fix it. That's what the LLMs do. I'd love to see one that knew the approach, and you could probably prompt it to do it with some very clever prompting. Maybe not ChatGPT. I don't think it'd take a very clever prompt to get it to run that process. Maybe something automated like Auto GPT, if you've ever seen that, which I think's an open source version of that Devon thing everyone's singing about. That I've seen, like Theo, what is it?
Yeah.
I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I want to give him a shout out. Seen him go through it. I think Devon's overblown and overhyped. And I've seen open source tools that effectively do the same thing. But I would love to see it use the test-driven development approach to some extent, because I think it's efficient. I think even for an AI, it'd be very efficient to do it that way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So we've talked about the benefits. Well, have we talked about the benefits?
Was what one thing, a little bit. There's one thing when you were talking about the happy paths, you also mentioned when you were talking about happy paths, unhappy paths, and testing. Well, you didn't call them unhappy paths. I've called them that now. Testing those unhappy paths. A challenge I've always had with testing is knowing what to test, because you can't, 100% test coverage. Yeah. Again, if you had someone championing it, you could probably do it. I actually really believe you could do it. I've worked on my own little projects here and gone, look, I can cover it easy. But then when you're on a team, you've got to manage. It's like herding cats sometimes. As soon as you got two people not doing coverage, then you have to, there's gap. The longer that goes on for, the harder it is to recover. That happens a lot in all sorts of things. But it's a big question for mine. I've often going to go into Drupal because that's what I know. When you've got even the question of unit tests, kernel tests, Drupal testing trait tests, behavioral tests. Already, I don't know which approach I should use. Plus, should I even be testing this thing? Is one challenge that I've never quite got the answer to. I don't think there's a straight up answer. It seems like an art form. I've never worked long enough with somebody to actually. So we've discussed that on this podcast before, the benefits of having a mentor.
Yeah. And
that's where we're talking about someone who can champion this. Learning testing, I find one of the hardest things, one of the most enjoyable, rewarding, promising things I've ever worked with. I've definitely learned how to write tests and can, but I've never quite mastered it. I've never worked with anybody else who's mastered it.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to ascertain, and that's the question of what to test. So I find my experience with testing is a lot of learning, and I would put it on my resume now. I can write tests. Of course, I've done it so many times, but I'm still in a place of I don't feel like I know what I'm doing. And at the same time, I think I know I've got more experience than a lot of people that claim they do know what they're doing. But there's a lot of gray areas, a lot of nuance, out of all the things I've ever done in coding, it's the thing that I'd use the phrase, there's an art to it more than anything else. Particularly that knowing what to test and what not to.
Yeah.
And how much coverage to give it. Because even when I've written tests before, you write all these tests and all these things, and then as soon as you go live, the user does, something happens, and you go, well, I didn't test for that. I wrote so many tests and didn't test that one. It's knowing what to test for is a skill that I think learning, because I've been coding for many, many years and then learning test 20 years after I learned how to code, it's hard to shoestring it on the back.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But I think it just comes from experience. And one thing I don't do is I don't write the tests first and then write the functionality. I build out the functionality, and then as you're building it out, you will experience bugs. And then just from experience, okay, this is something they're going to do, or this is a bug that I've experienced, so I'm going to write a test for it. And you can also, depending on the type of functionality that you're building, you might have requirements which specify, okay, a user cannot do this, or they can do that, or you have, and this comes down to forms. Okay, if you have a very specific set of requirements for a form, if they select this and this option, then only this conditional field should be displayed and things like that. So you can kind of test it around that. But again, it just depends on the type of functionality that you're building. And it just comes from experience, I think. And also, one thing I've liked to do is whenever a bug comes up, you then write a test as bugs come up to then verify that you fix that issue, just so that it doesn't come back up over and over again.
Yeah, I've worked in Scrum teams where I've brought that up so many times in retro. Can we please write tests for the bugs? But it's fixed now. Yeah, but
but it was fixed and now it's broken again. So just write a test.
Yeah. And then you've got that's an area. It's not because the test will catch that bug. It's because you now know there's an area of the system that's not covered.
Yeah.
Right. And things do change. And I think it's just an easy way to go. There's a obvious place that where something went wrong. We should write some tests around that. Yeah. So we benefits of test-driven development. Did we cover that? I mean, did we?
Well, we just now covered it. Write tests for bugs.
Yeah. Because I'm finding myself sitting here going, I am inherently an advocate for tests. I also hate them. I find them frustrating. I haven't particularly seen them improve my productivity, but I can totally see how they work over a long term. And that's probably why so many projects I worked on, they don't tend to think long term. It's like, get the project done, get it out the door. It's somebody else's problem. Don't need tests for that, right? However, what are the benefits? I mean, because I want to tell a story. One of the projects I worked on recently, where there was a problem in the CD stack, whereas we had multiple front ends. Oh, pardon me. Even in the testing environment, so you had the database in its own system. And the files were mounted in on an NFS file system. And there was a full stop missing somewhere in the CD code in a mount path. So it wasn't always mounting the right code, right? Ooh. So then during the build process, it'd update the database during the build with the latest code and run all the database updates. And then when it deployed, it'd deploy over the old code base. And for a week or two, all my tests failed. My tests failed. They failed again. They failed again. I kept reporting it. We were also in a situation where the infrastructure was incredibly slow. So it would take like 3 hours before I found out my test failed after pressing the go button. Yeah. And then I'd report that there's an issue and I'd get the rhetoric back. If the tests are failing, that means your code's broken. Now, this I think is a huge disadvantage of testing, right? Because the cultural psychological belief that test fail, code broke. Test fail, code's broken. And I fought that for 2 weeks before, and then I'm here having to, because I didn't have access to the CD infrastructure except to press the deploy button and get the report that things failed. It took about 3 hours for it to fail. So it took me over a week of pulling my hair out day after day to just finally get enough evidence to go, it's not my code, right? It's just not. And it was extremely frustrating. And it was tests, right? Because it was the test that I mean, it wasn't just the test. It was an issue in the CD. And the tests were failing because there was something broken, but it wasn't the code. It wasn't the application. It was the infrastructure. It was the continuous delivery environment itself that had the bug in it. So that's even with tests. I feel like in that situation, at least, there was a psychological reliance using the tests as a crutch. We've got a test for that. The test failed. So the test tested that feature. It failed. That feature's broken. But that wasn't the case at all. Right? It was the infrastructure underneath was just completely, well, it wasn't completely, there was a small issue, but for some reason I was the one that kept hitting it too. We had another dev on the team that for some reason he'd get lucky, right? Because it was, because there was different file systems, different cached versions of it.
Okay.
And just every time I deployed, I was the one getting unlucky enough to get the outdated cached. It wasn't a cache, but I'm not a CD. And that's what was hard, because I'm not a continuous delivery DevOps person.
Yeah.
Trying to solve a DevOps problem from outside without the keys to get in and have a look at it. Very frustrating. And it makes me think a lot about that kind of tests. It's easy to just make that mistake of the test. The test for this piece of code failed. That piece of code's broken. Not necessarily. At least not in. See, and that's what we start open talking about TDD. In TDD, I don't think you'd have that problem, because it's unit tests. The test is literally testing a unit of code. It's not testing abstracted away.
Yeah.
Right. It's not even running in that environment. The test, it's literally loading a function and nothing else. So because it's so much more narrow focused, I don't think you'd have that same situation. So, I mean, that's also part of our conversation, is test-driven development and testing aren't the same thing.
All right. That is true. That is true. But then you can have all the little unit tests that you have, but you're still going to have random bugs appear. And often when it comes to a website, there are certain, I don't want to say happy paths, but there are certain things that the website does.
Yeah.
So if you are an e-commerce website, the most important thing is to get transactions through. You want to test that. You want to make sure the transaction stuff always works. And coming back to this whole benefit of test-driven development.
What about data leaks and stuff like that, though? You want to be covering the tests of can't see other people's transactions and things like that.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely. But also, I'll mention one benefit when you are using a CMS that shall not be mentioned is when you update the modules or plugins, you can easily run tests on top of that. That is a benefit, I think. If you can reliably trust the tests, that they will pass. But I do understand that, it's not test-driven development.
Yep.
But you might have unit tests or kernel tests, whatever Drupal does.
Not to say there's no advantage to doing those things. I'm just I guess I'm a bit of a stick in the mud for correct language sometimes. Like test-driven development is test-driven development. Behavioral testing's behavioral testing. They're not the same thing.
Just like JavaScript, same thing, man. I had a manager once that said that to us. Java and JavaScript, it's the same thing. And then they'll always say, "Oh yeah, no, it's Java." It's like, you mean JavaScript? Oh yeah, it's the same thing. It's
not.
It's like, are we inheriting a Java platform or a website that's built using JavaScript? Anyway, but no, you are correct. Like, terminology plays a huge part. So there are benefits when it comes to test-driven development. But again, you have to make sure that your tests are passing, and you have to also make sure that you have confidence in those tests. Because I'll also jump into
that's a good phrase. I like that.
Yeah, I'll also jump in with a bit of a quick story. Now, one of the biggest websites that I've ever worked on, we did have a testing framework that will take around 40 to 50 minutes to run, and it'll run on every single PR. Okay, so you create a pull request, and you can only merge it if it passes. And they had a big TV screen where everyone could see, and it will either be red. Yeah, it would either be red or green depending if it's passed. It would spend like a dashboard. Yeah, it would spend probably 80 to 90% of the time in the red, because there'll always be something. And the annoying thing was, you want to get a simple hotfix out, especially if you're doing deployments. And we used to do fortnightly deployments, and you might deploy one thing and everything's okay. And then all of a sudden it's like, there's a quick CSS hotfix that needs to go out, a basic change. And then you have to wait for all the tests to pass. And then if you had a test that relied on, content, for example, and the content slightly changed in the testing environment, which then broke the test.
Yes.
It would have all these repercussions, and it's like, oh man, I just want this test to get passed so I can just push out this quick deployment.
Test isolation is an important thing.
Yes.
Because that's the number of times I've written code and then you run the test and some test off somewhere else breaks. You're like, well, I don't understand that. And you open it, I don't even understand this test that's broken, right? So here I've the same thing, done a very small, simple change, and some overly complicated test somewhere else in the system breaks, and you're just like, wow, I got, and I've literally worked on teams, may have done this myself, go, easy fix, turn the test off, delete that test. I don't get what it does. I don't know what it's for. I've got to get this job out of. We estimated an hour. That test is going to take me a week. The person that wrote it is not on the team anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's kind of like,
God, I'd love to work on a team where that was allowed, though, where exactly like you said, someone championed this so that when a situation like that came in, that you had a power that be who could step in and go, I know that's what I call a scrum master. That's what a scrum master's job is, as far as I'm concerned, can step in and go, all right, great. This 5 minute, hour long job that we estimated is actually more like a week course of these tests.
Yeah. Yeah.
Understand that. Let's put it, re-estimate it for the next sprint, pull it out. But in most of I've worked on some good Scrum teams. Most of them, 95% of the teams I've worked on, you don't get that kind of support, which is a shame. Because I hear a lot. I get on Agile around here. A lot of people complain about Scrum and Agile, but I've seen it work, and I've seen it not work. And every time it didn't work, we weren't really doing it anyway.
Yeah.
So I think it gets a bad rap. And I think things like TDD possibly does get a bad rap for similar reasons. That's hence why I was making that nuance, being very clear about what the differences are. Because TDD came out of extreme programming way back in the day, which is where Agile came in.
That's right.
There's a very close relationship between TDD and Agile. But I've never done pure TDD in my life. So,
yeah. Well, that's it. That is it. Okay, so that's really the benefits of test-driven development or testing. What about the practical examples of test-driven development? Well, we've kind of talked about that
a little bit. I've got an idea, though.
Yeah,
a classic example I've come across is almost a really, really easy example of where it's applicable is, what's the word? Password validation. I mean, in the real world, you've got password validators built anyway, but it's such a good example for something where you can sort of write a bunch of, for unit testing specifically, write a bunch of unit tests that are like, if you enter, if the user enters this, then this error should happen. I think that's a really simple example of something that's easy to write a test for.
Absolutely.
Yes. As a practical example, I think something like that is a very, very clear example where it's, I think I made my point.
Yeah. But I think for me, if I was ever in a situation where I was in charge of a website, which nowadays, like, I'm not really, I just get in there, maintain the Drupal site where I don't really have much oversight. Like, I've got pre-existing tools and there are tests. And if I am building out custom functionality, I will write tests and make sure they pass. But for me, the practical example, the practical example is really making sure you figure out the most important parts of your website and just have tests against them. And if you keep getting bugs around the same thing, write a test to pick it up. And also, if you can, try and automate it so that you can run it on a nightly basis or even every second day. You can run half the tests to speed things up. You can run all the tests then once a week. If it takes too long, there's many ways of doing it. But yeah, just getting some type of automation. Let the machines do the work. Don't rely on a developer to have everything set up locally to
You
run.
sound like a
things.
true dev. Automate everything.
Automate, yeah. That's the point.
That's a dev catchcry. I've been since I was a junior, so I just want to automate everything, and
Yep.
almost to the detriment that you spend your whole life trying to. I mean, one of the most frustrating things in development is when you automate. That's that upstream problem I was talking about before. You spend like a few months automating your workflow, and then the tooling changes, and now your automation's all that, and it's like it's changed enough that none of your automations work anymore. You're like, rewrite them all. Like, I was an inch from paradise, and then you changed it. I've totally been in that situation. And I think that's why people come up with things like Lando and DDev as Docker environments and stuff. Because there are these pain points that we have as devs that we want to automate things, always trying to automate things. But am I saying that the desire to automate everything and make everything smoother is the same reason we have way too much abstraction and everything's hard to fix?
More developers love abstraction. They absolutely love it. All right. Okay. So any common, we've covered the challenges, misconceptions. I think we have gone through absolutely everything.
We've covered the misconceptions.
Yes,
quite,
we have.
Quite a lot. The one thing I had on my mind to discuss was, that's very, very, so resistant now. I'm going to say Drupal. Because Drupal as a product, and I'm sure this applies to other products too. I imagine WordPress core has its own set of tests.
Yeah.
I remember having a discussion with my tech lead once because we were setting up tests, and I was trying to get at his urge to get our testing environment to run all the core tests for Drupal. And I find there was a big learning curve. I had to set up the environment and get it all working. They take ages, and I couldn't get them to pass. And I went out into the community and put the question. I go, how do you get all the core tests to run? And they're like, why do you want to do that for? Don't do that. That's like, it's already tested. That's the point, right? All those tests with Drupal core tests, they run in Drupal's own CI/CD environment. They check that Drupal core works. Drupal core works. Don't bother doing that. I've come back to my tech lead, very relieved. Of course, I can't figure this out. It's very hard. I can't work out how to get it all to work. It feels like the wrong idea. Giving him that same feedback from somebody, like the feedback I got was from somebody very credible and very knowledgeable on the testing team themselves. Said, don't even bother. I came back and he says, yeah, but what if one of the codes we wrote in a module affects the behavior of a thing in core and causes a core test to fail? You'd want to know about that, wouldn't you? And then pushing back. I ended up just refusing to do the job, I think, right? But that is a question. The question of what to test. It's not only what to test; it's what tests to run. Because like that's the same we said before. When you're doing pure to the letter test-driven development, you're writing unit tests and only unit tests.
Yeah,
and the whole suite of them for your project should run under. Now, even that, I'm not sure on the question whether you run the whole suite of unit tests or if you only run the tests relevant to your little bit of code. Therefore, they run in like that, literally.
Yeah.
But that's the question of not just what tests to write, what tests to run, and when is another question that I don't necessarily know the answer to. It's really, that's why this is a fascinating topic, because I feel like I can speak to it. I know what testing is. I can even tell you what test-driven development is, how it works, how it's different from other types of tests, what challenges I've ran into, what problems I've had with it, where Selenium's broken. I can speak to all this, and then at the end of the day, I don't know how to write tests. It's, because there's that question of when and what and why. As I spoke to it before, there's an art form to it.
Yeah.
And I don't know who's listening to this. If there's anybody new who's getting into testing, I'd love to at least get that feedback, or go, to me, it's an enigma.
Yeah.
this sense. One that I seem to be quite well understand, but there's a mystery in there that I can't quite put my finger on, which we seem to be narrowing in on the But then also, look, I know writing kernel tests, I found they slowed me up so long because they're a whole skill set in themselves. And then kernel tests are a particular test in Drupal that sort of semi-bootstrap Drupal without booting a whole site, so that which is supposed to be so you don't have to do a whole heap of mocking to get your unit test to work. But then writing a kernel test, there's all sorts of dependencies. You've got to load certain modules. You've got to load certain configs. You've got to make certain schemas are set. There's certain ways to do that. Took me years to get to the level of understanding to be able to write a kernel test at all. And I see people that seem to pick it up in months, or weeks even. They're writing tests, and I imagine they're in a position where they've got somebody to ask questions, whereas I've always just been a lot of these things I've always been the champion for it, been on a team and going, we don't have tests, we need to write tests. All right, Bevan, write tests. Okay, now I'm learning to write tests while everybody else is getting their job done, and I am figuring out how to write tests. And they're never quite getting the hang of it because it's always there's a phrase you're always pushing shit uphill. We've never sworn on this channel before.
Oh,
we have now.
2 swear words today,
twice.
man. You're gonna have to flag this as explicit. Oh,
explicit,
Bevan, man. Yeah,
damn. Oh.
Or you're gonna have to just bleep yourself out. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I'm not worried about it. It's gonna get worse. It's being very polite.
Well, that's it.
So,
all right. Well, I think that's it. We're at 55 minutes. Let's wrap it up.
I chewed up that last 5.
That's all right.
Challenge
That's all right.
accepted.
You have a new mic, by the way. I don't know if people have noticed.
Does everybody? Can you? Do I better sound good if I'm saying this at the end and it sounds like poop? We're going to. I have a new mic. It's been in the mail, waiting to come. It's the most exciting thing ever.
It is, man.
Because
hey, getting new hardware. No,
we're a professional podcast now. Like people.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Join our Patreon. Send us a what do you call those things? Those not Snapchat. What's it called? A super chat.
Oh, super chat.
We'll go live. Send us some super chats.
Sure, yeah.
Go to this address. Ignore the credit card number.
Yeah, that's it.
It's
No, you're sounding a lot better now with a better microphone. And
fantastic. Now everyone's going to hear my bad opinions and actually understand what I said. I'm going to get in trouble.
That's all right. All right. Well, let's just wrap it up there. If you have any comments or questions about test-driven development, or you just want to, give your opinions, please chuck in comments. I also believe that we are on Spotify now.
Yeah.
Yes.
We are.
There you go.
Absolutely. We set up a Spotify account. We'll be going in other places as we get our head around how things work. We're going take over the world.
Places, man.
We're
going places. But I think, YouTube's the number one place. And
I like YouTube.
Yeah. The tubes.
All right.
Well, let's leave it at that. Thank you very much. And please leave a comment and we'll catch you all next time.
See you later.
Down.